If you had told me 5 years ago that my husband, Harold Dawson, would be led away in handcuffs in front of our entire town, I would have laughed right in your face. Harold, the pillar of our church, the man with the warm handshake at every Rotary meeting, the smiling grandfather who carved turkeys at Thanksgiving. Oh, not Harold. But that's exactly how it happened. On a crisp October night, beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Lincoln County Civic Center, the man I'd shared 48 years of my life with was exposed for what he truly was. Me. I stood there in my navy blue dress, trembling but steady as whispers tore through the crowd like wildfire. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more true stories of betrayal and resilience told through my eyes as a grandmother. And while you're here, leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stories like this don't begin in the middle. They start in the small cracks you ignore, the silences you excuse, the little betrayals that don't feel big enough to call out, until they pile up so high you can't see over them. Let me take you back. Back before the police, before the whispers, before I learned that my entire marriage was balanced on lies as thin as tissue paper. I was born Eleanor James, but for nearly 5 decades I've been Eleanor Dawson, though most folks just call me Ellie. I turned 70 this past spring, and in all those years I've lived in the same small Ohio town, Willow Creek. Harold and I bought our house in 1975, a red brick colonial on Maplewood Drive, right after he got promoted at the bank. It wasn't fancy by city standards, but in our neighborhood it was a prize. Back then I thought I'd found my forever. We raised our children, Caroline and David, under that roof. We hosted Thanksgiving dinners where the dining room table sagged under turkey, mashed potatoes, and my mother's cornbread stuffing. Summers were for block parties with sparklers and hot dogs, winters for shoveling snow and sipping hot cocoa by the fireplace. From the outside, we looked like a postcard of Midwestern stability. Harold was respected, I was liked, and our kids grew up solid and good. Looking back now, I see how carefully Harold cultivated that image. To the outside world, we were the Dawsons, the couple who had it figured out. But behind that polished smile and firm handshake, Harold was someone I didn't fully know. The first time I noticed something off, it was small. A drawer in Harold's home office was left slightly open. That office was his sanctuary, lined with shelves of books on finance, theology, and leadership, plaques from his years at the bank, framed photos of Rotary meetings and golf outings. Normally, Harold kept everything tidy, but that day the desk drawer wasn't shut all the way. I bent down, meaning only to close it. My hand froze when I saw what was inside. A phone. Not his regular smartphone, the one that sat charging on the nightstand every night. No, this was an older flip phone, tucked away like something he didn't want seen. I picked it up. My pulse thudded in my ears. Why would Harold need a second phone? He'd never been a technology man. He struggled to check his email without asking me for help. Yet here was this little device, hidden away. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up and asked for a code. For a second I almost put it back, telling myself it was nothing. But curiosity is a stubborn companion. I tried the only numbers I could think of, our wedding anniversary. 05-18. The screen unlocked. I wish I hadn't looked. The messages were right there. Dozens of them. I scrolled, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. Can't stop thinking about last night. Don't forget the wine for the cabin. She'll never suspect a thing. My breath caught in my throat. She'll never suspect. That was me. And then the photo. Not obscene, but intimate enough. A woman's hand in Harold's, a silver bracelet sparkling on her wrist. I knew my own hands, spotted with age, the veins rising under thin skin. That was not my hand. I snapped the phone shut like it had burned me. My knees trembled so badly I had to sit down in Harold's leather office chair. The world tilted sideways. Harold. My Harold. The man who led the Sunday school prayer. The man who held my hand at the hospital when I gave birth to Caroline. The man who still cut the grass in neat diagonal lines so the neighbors would praise his work. He had another woman. And he thought I'd never suspect. That evening, I set the table as if nothing was wrong. Meatloaf, green beans, mashed potatoes. Harold came in whistling, kissed my cheek, and washed his hands before sitting down. "Smells wonderful, Ellie," he said, spooning gravy over his plate. His voice was the same as always. Warm, ordinary, familiar. I smiled back, though inside my chest was a storm. Because here's the thing. When you've been married nearly half a century, You don't explode the first time you see trouble. You wait. You gather. You let him hang himself with his own rope. So that's what I did. The signs came quicker once I started watching. A new cologne. Not the Old Spice he'd worn since Nixon, but something sharp and woodsy. On sale at Walgreens, he said. Except Harold hated shopping. Late nights. Board meetings, he claimed. But when I casually asked our neighbor Tom, who also sat on the senior center board, he frowned. We haven't had a meeting in weeks. Finning. A new tie here, a golf club there. But then charges I couldn't place. Restaurants in towns we never visited, jewelry I never received. The man who once shared every detail with me now carried secrets in his pockets. I called my sister Margaret. She lives down in Florida, retired near Daytona Beach. Margaret is 5 years older than me and twice as blunt. Ellie, she said after I told her about the phone, don't you dare sit quiet and play the fool. Men like Harold count on women like you to stay polite. But what if I'm wrong? I whispered. What if there's some explanation? Sweetheart, she said, her voice firm, you found a secret phone. You read the messages. That's not imagination. That's betrayal. The word hit me like a slap. Betrayal. A week later, I was in the attic pulling down holiday decorations. One of the boxes was heavier than I remembered. I dragged it down, opened it, and froze. Inside, beneath the tangle of Christmas lights, was a bundle of envelopes tied with ribbon. I untied it with trembling hands. Letters. The first one I read nearly shattered me. Harold, the way you held me by the lake last night, I thought my heart would burst. I don't care how careful we have to be. Every secret moment with you is worth it. She'll never understand you like I do. Yours always, Lorraine. Lorraine. I rifled through the others. Dozens of them. Love notes, promises, plans for the future. A cabin by Lake Harrison. Dreams of a life together. Tears blurred my eyes. 48 years of marriage, and my husband had another woman writing him love letters while I ironed his shirts and baked his pies. That night, Harold came home late again. He smelled faintly of wine and wood smoke. I sat in my chair, the letters hidden beneath a cushion, and asked, "How was the meeting?" He smiled. "Productive." And that's when I knew. This wasn't a fling. He wasn't just lying. He was preparing to replace me. But Harold Dawson didn't realize something important. I may be 70 years old, but I am not weak. I decided right then I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry in front of him. No, I was going to wait. Watch. Collect every piece of proof I needed. And when the time came, I'd make sure the whole town saw the truth about Harold Dawson. Because if he thought I'd go quietly into the shadows, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. When you've been married as long as I have, you learn a thing or two about patience. It isn't easy, but it's the only way you survive raising children, balancing bills, and making it through the long winters of both marriage and Midwest weather. So when I found those letters in the attic, tied up neat like a bouquet of thorns, I didn't explode. I didn't march into Harold's office and wave them in his face. I tucked them back into the box, slid it under the Christmas lights, and dusted off my hands. Because if Harold thought he could lie to me, I was going to lie right back. The next morning over breakfast, Harold stirred his coffee like nothing in the world was amiss. He asked about Caroline's latest email from Denver, if David had called from Cincinnati, and what I thought of Pastor Graham's sermon on humility. Humility. That nearly made me choke on my toast. I smiled sweetly. You know, Harold, I've been thinking about volunteering at the Historical Society again. Give me something to do a few afternoons a week. He nodded, distracted by his newspaper. That sounds fine, Ellie. Keeps you busy. He had no idea that what I really meant was, I'll have time to follow you. The first Friday I shadowed him, I felt ridiculous. Like some character in a crime show, sitting low in my sensible Buick in the Kroger parking lot. Harold had told me he had a board luncheon. But instead of heading to the senior center, his Chevy turned onto Highway 12 and kept going. I followed at a careful distance, praying he wouldn't glance in the rearview mirror. My palms were sweating so bad I could barely keep a grip on the steering wheel. He drove 30 minutes north into a part of the county we never visited. Past cornfields and horse farms, into the wooded edge of Lake Harrison. That's when I saw it. A cabin. Weathered wood, smoke curling from the chimney, and a blue SUV already parked out front. Harold pulled in beside it like he'd done it 100 times. He got out, straightened his jacket, and knocked. The door opened, and there she was, Lorraine. I didn't need to hear their conversation. I didn't need to see the way her hand rested lightly on his chest as she drew him inside. The body language was enough. Intimate. Familiar. My husband disappeared into that cabin, and I sat in my car watching the smoke drift from the chimney like a signal of everything I'd lost. It wasn't a fling. It wasn't a mistake. It was a life. A whole secret life he'd built without me. I drove home in silence, the road blurring under me. My mind ran through 48 years of marriage like a reel of film. Our wedding vows at St. Mark's, Harold's proud smile when Caroline was born, the nights we stayed up late painting the living room walls. How much of it had been real? And worse, how much of it had already been slipping away while I was too busy folding laundry and balancing the checkbook to notice? That evening, Harold returned home at 7:30 sharp, carrying a bag from the local hardware store. Got caught up at the board luncheon, he explained easily. Stopped for some supplies. Faucets leaking in the basement again. I looked at him across the kitchen, his hair neatly combed, his shirt freshly pressed. A man who had just come from another woman's arms and yet could lie as easily as breathing. Thank you for taking care of that, I said, keeping my voice level. I wouldn't know what to do without you. And oh, how he smiled at that. He had no idea I'd seen everything. I called Margaret the next day. She answered on the second ring, the sound of gulls and waves in the background. Well, she asked. Did you get anything? I told her. The cabin, Lorraine, the hand on his chest. Margaret didn't curse often, but that day she did. Ellie, you can't sit on this. You need proof, something undeniable. Because when you confront a man like Harold, he'll deny it until the day he dies. I know, I whispered. That's why I need help. Margaret was quiet for a beat. Help with what? Finding someone who can dig, I said. Someone who can give me everything. Dates, photos, bank records. I'm not going to make a fool of myself by marching in with suspicions. I want the truth carved in stone. She gave me a name. A woman named Valerie Cruz, a private investigator out of Columbus. Margaret swore by her. Said Valerie had caught her neighbor's husband red-handed 5 years ago. Evidence so solid he never showed his face in church again. I wrote down the number with shaking hands. Because that's when it hit me. I was no longer just a wife who'd been betrayed. I was preparing for battle. I met Valerie at a diner off I-71. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a leather notebook. She listened as I poured out everything. The secret phone, the letters, the cabin, Lorraine. Do you have the phone now? She asked. Yes, I admitted. Hidden in my sewing basket. Good, she said. That's leverage. But if you want the full picture, I'll need to follow him. Photograph him. Trace his financials if possible. Affairs leave paper trails. How much will this cost? I asked. 500 to start, she said plainly. More if I need to go deeper. I thought about my rainy day fund tucked in an envelope in the linen closet. Harold never asked about it. He thought it was just for fabric and quilting supplies. He didn't need to know I was about to spend it exposing him. Do it, I told her. I want everything. The waiting was the hardest part. 2 weeks passed. Harold went about his routines. Church on Sundays, golf on Wednesdays, poker with the Rotary men on Fridays. Except now I knew better. Each time he slipped out the door, I wondered if he was really at poker or if he was at Lorraine's, whispering promises in her ear. At night he lay beside me, snoring softly, while I stared at the ceiling fan spinning above us. Sometimes I pressed my palm to the empty space between us in the bed, the canyon that had grown wider and wider without me realizing it. I thought of the vows we'd said, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. I had held up my side. I had stayed when Harold lost his job at the bank and drank too much whiskey for a season. I had nursed him through gallbladder surgery. I had smiled through decades of Rotary dinners and church picnics. And now this was my reward. Lies and love letters from another woman. One evening Valerie called. You might want to sit down, Mrs. Dawson. I gripped the phone. What did you find? I followed him last night, she said. He picked up Lorraine from her office downtown. They drove to a restaurant in Columbus. Expensive place. White tablecloths, champagne. I got photos. My chest tightened. That's not all, she continued. After dinner, they checked into the Hawthorne Hotel. Room 314. I waited. They didn't come out until morning. I closed my eyes. Even though I already knew, hearing it said out loud sliced me open all over again. "I'll send you the pictures," Valerie said gently. "You'll want to see them for yourself." I sat at the kitchen table staring at the manila envelope when it arrived. Inside were photographs. Harold holding Lorraine's hand across the restaurant table. Harold's arm around her as they walked into the hotel. Harold kissing her in the parking lot. Proof. Stone cold proof. My hands shook, but my mind was clear. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about survival. Because tucked into the report Valerie sent was another detail. Harold had been moving money. Small withdrawals over the last 18 months, funneled into an account in his name only. Nearly $40,000. It was more than an affair. It was an exit plan. That night I set dinner on the table as usual. Roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans. Harold carved the chicken with practiced hands, humming as he worked. I watched him, the man I thought I knew, and realized he wasn't planning to grow old with me. He wasn't planning to sit on our porch swing drinking lemonade in our 80s. He was planning to disappear. And he thought I'd never suspect. I lay awake in bed until Harold's snores filled the room. Then I whispered to myself, "No, Harold Dawson. You will not leave me humiliated and alone. You will not walk away with my dignity or our money. You wanted secrets. Now you'll have to face mine." Because while Harold was busy living a double life, I was preparing one of my own. And when the day came, I would make sure every last person in Willow Creek saw Harold Dawson for who he truly was. Once you know the truth, it changes the way you see everything. I looked at Harold across the breakfast table, stirring cream into his coffee, and wondered how many lies were tucked behind that ordinary gesture. Every smile he gave me, every pat on my shoulder, every absent-minded kiss before he left the house. It all felt hollow, rehearsed, practiced. But here's what Harold never understood. Betrayal doesn't always make you weaker. Sometimes it steels you. And in my case, it sharpened me like a blade. The very next Sunday, we sat in our usual pew at St. Mark's. Third row from the front, right side. Harold had his Bible open, nodding along as Pastor Graham spoke about honesty being the cornerstone of a righteous life. I almost laughed out loud. Harold closed his eyes reverently during the final prayer, his voice deep as he murmured the words. Then, as always, he shook hands with the men in our row, clapped Deacon Morris on the back, and lingered a little too long greeting the ladies. Always the charmer, my Harold. I smiled and played my part. That's the thing about small towns. Appearances are everything. So I kept mine polished. Because while Harold kept up his act, I was rehearsing mine. A few days later, I invited Marlene over for coffee. Marlene has lived across the street for 30 years. The kind of neighbor who notices everything but rarely says much unless asked. She knew when a teenager came home after curfew, when Mrs. Carter's begonias bloomed early, when the mailman lingered too long on Betty Jean's porch. If I needed the neighborhood grapevine primed, Marlene was the one. We sat at my kitchen table with lemon pound cake between us. I poured her coffee and said as casually as I could, "Marlene, I'm thinking of doing something special for our anniversary this fall. A little gathering at the Civic Center. You know, nothing fancy, just friends, family, a few neighbors." Her eyes lit up. "Oh, Ellie, that sounds wonderful. 48 years, isn't it?" 48, I said, my voice steady. I thought a surprise party might be nice. For Harold. And just like that, the first seed was planted. I didn't tell her my real plan, of course. Not yet. Instead, I let her run with the idea, suggesting guest lists, decorations, and who might bring what dish. In a town like Willow Creek, news spreads faster than wildfire. I knew within a week, everyone from our church circle to the Rotary men would be buzzing about the Dawsons' anniversary celebration. Perfect. Let them think it was a love story worth celebrating. The greater the illusion, the sweeter the reveal. Meanwhile, I stayed in touch with Valerie, my private investigator. She sent me regular updates. Harold and Lorraine at the cabin, Harold withdrawing more cash, Harold making calls from that secret phone. One afternoon, I sat with her in the diner again, photos spread between us. "You've got enough here to divorce him 6 ways from Sunday," she said, tapping the stack. "I don't want just a divorce," I told her. "I want exposure. Public exposure. I want Harold to feel what it's like to have the ground pulled out from under you while everyone you know is watching." Valerie studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then you're going to need more than photos. You're going to need timing." I spent my evenings at the sewing table, pretending to work on a quilt for Caroline's new apartment. In truth, I was organizing the evidence into a kind of presentation. Copies of the letters, enlarged photos, even the financial records Valerie dug up, highlighted to show how Harold had been bleeding our savings into that secret account. Each page, each picture felt like a brick I was stacking, one on top of the other, building a wall Harold would never climb over. But I didn't just want proof. I wanted impact. And that meant setting the stage carefully. The hardest part was keeping up the mask. Harold grew more careless as the weeks passed. He came home later, sometimes humming as if he'd just stepped out of some romantic movie scene. Once I caught a faint smear of lipstick on his collar. Not my shade, not even close. "Ellie," he said that night when he saw me looking, "I must have brushed against Marlene when she kissed my cheek at Bible study. You know how she is." I smiled. "Of course, Harold." But inside I was cataloging it all. I leaned on Margaret during this time more than I ever had in my life. We talked on the phone late at night when Harold was asleep. "You sure about this?" she asked me one evening. "Exposure like that, it's not just him you'll be hurting. The whole town will be buzzing. Caroline and David will hear it too." "I've thought about that," I said quietly. "But I can't just sit back and let Harold walk all over me. If he wants a new life with Lorraine, he can have it. But he won't leave me broken. Not after 48 years. Margaret sighed. "You always were the stronger one." I don't know about strong. But I knew one thing, I was determined. The pieces came together faster than I expected. Marlene and a handful of church ladies took the surprise anniversary and ran with it. Before long, I was fielding calls about caterers, tablecloth colors, and whether Harold preferred lemon or chocolate cake. "Chocolate," I answered, hiding my smile. "He's always been a chocolate man." If only they knew. Meanwhile, Harold was playing his own part, though he didn't realize it. He grew cocky, sloppy. He took longer lunches, came home with his tie loosened, sometimes with a faint smell of perfume clinging to his jacket. He never noticed the way I watched him, the way I smiled too easily, as if nothing in the world had changed. But inside I was timing every move. One night he came home carrying a new golf club. I asked him where it came from, though I already knew. "Rotary raffle," he said, eyes bright. "Lucky draw." I nodded. Later, when he went to bed, I checked the tag, still in the trash. "Bought at a sporting goods store in Columbus." He thought I wasn't looking. But I was. I was looking at everything. By the time September rolled around, the Civic Center was booked. The invitations whispered down the grapevine, and Harold still had no clue. He thought he was living two lives, the dutiful husband in Willow Creek and the passionate lover in Columbus. But I was preparing to merge those two lives in the most spectacular way possible. Because Harold wasn't the only one who could keep secrets. The night before the party, I sat in my bedroom with the evidence spread across the bed. Photos of Harold kissing Lorraine outside the Hawthorne Hotel. Copies of love letters where she signed herself, "Yours always." Bank records showing transfers to his secret account. I put them all neatly into a presentation folder. Not too many pages, just enough to deliver a blow no one could deny. Then I slid the folder into my purse. And I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow Harold Dawson learns what it feels like to be betrayed." The morning of the party dawned crisp and golden, the kind of September day Ohio does best. The maples along Maplewood Drive were just beginning to blush red at their tips, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and apples. A beautiful day, almost too beautiful for what was coming. Harold rose early, humming as he dressed in his tan slacks and navy sport coat. "Big day," he said cheerfully, knotting his tie. "Board luncheon, then golf with the fellows." I sipped my coffee and smiled. "Don't be late tonight, Harold. I thought we might have a quiet dinner." He patted my shoulder, the picture of the devoted husband. Wouldn't miss it. I watched him drive away in his Chevy, knowing he was headed straight for Lorraine. He thought he had the day mapped out, but he had no idea that every step he took was leading him to the Civic Center that evening. To me. To the truth. At noon, I met Marlene and a half-dozen church ladies at the Civic Center. They'd already transformed the hall with blue and white streamers, strings of twinkling lights, and tables set with silver cloths. A banner stretched across the far wall. "Happy 48th anniversary, Harold and Ellie Dawson." "Oh, Ellie," Marlene said, bustling up to me. "Isn't it just perfect? Everyone's so excited. Harold's going to be floored." I clasped her hands. "Thank you, Marlene. I don't know what I'd do without you." And that was true. Without her, without all of them, the illusion wouldn't work. They thought they were helping me honor a love story. What they were really helping me build was a stage for Harold's downfall. By 3 o'clock, the caterers were in the kitchen, the cake was delivered, and guests began to arrive. Old friends from church, Harold's golf buddies, Caroline and David with their families. My heart squeezed when I hugged Caroline. She whispered, "This is so sweet, Mom. Dad's going to love it." David clapped me on the back. "You outdid yourself." I forced a smile, praying that when the truth came out, they'd understand why I'd chosen this path. At 5:15, Marlene stationed herself by the door. "I'll call you when Harold arrives," she whispered. "Everyone will hide, then shout surprise." I nodded, my pulse pounding. I slipped the presentation folder into my purse and checked my reflection in the window. Navy dress, pearls, steady smile. I looked like the picture of a proud wife. Inside, my hands trembled. The door swung open at 5:30. Harold stepped inside, adjusting his tie, looking faintly puzzled by the darkened hall. "Ellie," he called. "Marlene." The lights blazed on. Surprise. 40 voices shouted at once. Streamers popped, applause filled the air. Harold froze, his jaw dropping. Then slowly he smiled. "Well, I'll be," he said, feigning astonishment. "Ellie, you did all this?" I walked toward him, heart hammering. "Happy anniversary, Harold." The crowd cheered again. He flushed, shook hands, accepted backslaps and hugs. To anyone else he looked touched, overwhelmed. But I saw it. The flicker of guilt in his eyes, the darting glance toward me as though wondering how much I knew. Dinner was served. Roast beef, scalloped potatoes, green beans, almondine. Harold raised a glass of champagne and toasted me, his voice smooth. "To Ellie, the best partner a man could ask for. 48 years and counting." The guests clapped. I smiled and lifted my glass, but the champagne tasted bitter in my mouth. After dinner, Marlene tapped her glass with a spoon. "Speech," she called. Others took up the chant. "Speech. Speech." Harold chuckled, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "Well, I don't know what to say." "Then let me," I said, rising to my feet. The room quieted. Harold looked up at me, surprise flickering across his face. I walked to the podium at the front of the room, the presentation folder tucked under my arm. 48 years, I began, my voice steady. That's how long Harold and I have been married. Nearly half a century of shared memories, raising children, building a life. I glanced at Harold. He smiled, though I saw the tension in his jaw. "We've had good times," I continued. "Hard times too. Times that tested us. Times that made us stronger. Or so I thought." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. I opened the folder and held up the first page. A photograph of Harold holding hands with Lorraine across the table at the Hawthorne Hotel. "Because it turns out," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, "the man I thought I knew has been living another life." Gasps broke out. Head swiveled toward Harold. His face drained of color. "Ellie," he began, but I raised my hand. "No, Harold. You've had your say. Now it's my turn." I held up another page. A copy of a love letter. "She'll never suspect a thing," I read aloud. "Every secret moment with you is worth it. Yours always, Lorraine." A stunned hush filled the hall. Then whispers began, spreading like wildfire. I laid the letter down and picked up the bank records highlighted in yellow. And while he was planning his escape, Harold siphoned nearly $40,000 from our accounts. Money meant for our retirement. Money meant for our children's future. I looked up, my eyes sweeping the room. He thought he'd leave me behind. He thought no one would ever know. But tonight everyone knows. The crowd erupted. Some gasped, some muttered, others shook their heads in disbelief. Caroline clapped a hand over her mouth. David stared at his father with open disgust. Harold surged to his feet, face red. "This is slander," he barked. "You've lost your mind." I calmly laid the last photo on the podium. Harold kissing Lorraine in the Civic Center parking lot, taken just last week. "Does this look like my mind is playing tricks?" I asked, my voice quiet but fierce. The room fell silent. Harold's facade crumbled. He stammered, sputtered, looked wildly around the room as though searching for an ally. But none came. Even his golf buddies looked away. Finally, he turned to me, his voice low and desperate. "Ellie, please, let's not do this here. We can talk." I straightened. 48 years, Harold. And you chose lies. Tonight the mask comes off. The rest happened in a blur. Some guests tried to comfort me, others slipped out in awkward silence. Caroline wept quietly at her table. David confronted his father, voice shaking with anger. And Harold? He stood there, pale and sweating, as the life he'd so carefully constructed collapsed in front of him. I gathered my folder, stepped down from the podium, and walked out of the hall into the cool September night. Behind me, I heard the swell of whispers, the sound of a man undone. And for the first time in years, I felt free. I wish I could tell you the hall emptied quietly, with dignified whispers and polite exits. But betrayal doesn't dissolve so neatly. The night after the party at the Civic Center played out like a storm tearing through a small town. Sudden, violent, and unforgettable. When I stepped outside into the September night, the air was crisp, almost sweet with the scent of fallen leaves. But behind me, in that brightly lit hall, voices rose in a clamor. People gasped, argued, muttered. Harold's name, my name, Lorraine's name, tossed around like confetti. Caroline hurried after me. Her heels clicked on the pavement, and when she reached me, her face was blotchy with tears. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is it true? All of it?" I looked into my daughter's eyes, the same hazel eyes Harold once swore she'd inherited from him, and I nodded. "Every word, Caroline. Every photo." She covered her mouth, sobbing. Then, with a trembling voice, she added, "I suspected. I saw him once with her. I thought maybe I was wrong, but I didn't want to hurt you." The words stung, but I pulled her into my arms. "You didn't hurt me, sweetheart." "He did." David emerged next, his jaw set, fury radiating off him. He didn't speak at first, just stood staring back at the Civic Center doors where his father remained inside. Finally, he muttered, "I'll never forgive him for this. Never." I laid a hand on his arm. "Don't let his choices eat at you, David. This isn't your burden to carry." But even as I said it, I knew Harold's betrayal had rippled outward, touching us all. Inside, Harold tried to save face. At least that's what Marlene told me later. He claimed the photos were fabricated, the letters forged, the bank records misunderstood. But in a town like Willow Creek, reputations are delicate things. Once cracked, they shatter. By the time the party ended, most of our friends couldn't meet his eyes. The deacons whispered among themselves. Harold's golf partners muttered excuses and slipped out early. Even Pastor Graham avoided him. Lorraine never showed. Maybe she got wind of what was happening. Or maybe she decided her future with Harold wasn't worth the spectacle. Either way, Harold was left standing alone in a room full of people who now saw him not as a pillar but as a fraud. We drove home in silence. I stared out the passenger window, my purse heavy on my lap with the folder of evidence still inside. Harold gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles shone white. Finally, as we pulled into the driveway, he snapped. "How could you?" he hissed. "How could you humiliate me like that? In front of everyone?" I turned my head, my voice calm. "How could you, Harold? How could you betray me for years, drain our savings, and plan to leave me like I was nothing? You humiliated yourself." I just turned on the lights. He slammed the car door and stormed inside. I followed slowly, my steps steady. For once, it wasn't me scrambling to catch up. The next days were chaos. The phone rang constantly, neighbors calling, some to offer sympathy, others fishing for details. I answered only a few, keeping my voice even, refusing to feed the gossip mill. At church, the whispers were deafening. Pastor Graham called me into his office. "Ellie," he said, "maybe it would be best if you stepped back from choir for a season. Let things cool down." I nodded politely, though inside anger simmered. Harold had sinned, and yet it was me being asked to step aside. That's how it often is for women. We carry the shame of men's choices like it's stitched into our skin. But I wasn't going to let that shame stick. Harold, meanwhile, shrank before my eyes. He stopped shaving, stopped smiling, stopped answering the door. He moped around the house like a ghost, muttering that people misunderstood, that it wasn't as bad as it looked. One night, I found him sitting in the dark in his recliner. He looked up at me and said, "Ellie, we can fix this. We can move past it." I almost laughed. "Past what, Harold? The hotel rooms? The love letters? The money you stole from us? Or the life you planned with Lorraine while I folded your shirts?" His face crumpled. For the first time, he looked small to me. Not powerful. Not charming. Just small. Within a week, Lorraine's name disappeared from his lips. I heard she'd sold the cabin at Lake Harrison. Rumor was she'd packed up and moved to Columbus. She left Harold behind just as quickly as she'd taken him. And that was when it hit me. Harold wasn't just a cheater. He was a fool. A 72-year-old fool who thought he could buy a second chance at youth with another woman and a pile of stolen money. But Lorraine had taken what she wanted and walked away. Me. I was still standing. The day I visited my lawyer was the day Harold realized I wasn't bluffing. "I'm filing for divorce," I told him, sliding the papers across the table. He sputtered. "Ellie, please. Think of the children. Think of the grandchildren." "I am," I said, my voice like steel. "I'm thinking of the example I want to set. That betrayal has consequences. That women don't have to stay silent." He begged, threatened, pleaded. None of it moved me. By Christmas, the divorce was finalized. I kept the house, the retirement accounts, and the dignity he thought he could steal. Harold got his car, his pension, and a reputation in ruins. The months that followed were quieter, lonelier in some ways. Old friends kept their distance, unsure which side to take. At church, some avoided me, while others whispered words of encouragement in the hallway. But new life began to creep in too. Caroline invited me to visit Denver. David started calling more often. I joined a walking group at the local park. For the first time in years, I bought a set of paints and brushes and let myself dabble in watercolors. Each day, the weight on my shoulders grew lighter. One afternoon in March, I passed the Civic Center where it had all unfolded. For the first time, I didn't feel shame. I felt pride. Because that night, I had chosen to reveal the truth rather than hide behind lies. And though it had been painful, it was also liberating. Harold, I later heard, moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. He kept to himself, avoided most public places. Some said he still called Lorraine, but she never answered. Others said he spent his afternoons drinking cheap bourbon and staring at old photos. I don't know which is true. And I don't care. Because Harold's story ended the night I exposed him. Mine was just beginning. There's a saying I once heard. When a fire tears through the forest, it doesn't just destroy. It clears space for new growth. That's what my life felt like after Harold. For months, I thought the fire of betrayal had burned me down to nothing but ash. But slowly, quietly, tender green shoots began to push through. New routines, new friendships, even new dreams. For the first time in nearly 5 decades, I wasn't someone's wife. I was just Ellie. And I had to learn what that meant. The house felt strange at first. Too quiet. Too big. I'd walk past Harold's empty recliner and feel a pang of something. Not love, not even grief, but habit. For 48 years he'd been part of the furniture of my life. Now he was gone. But empty spaces invite possibility. I started by painting the kitchen. For years Harold had vetoed my ideas. He liked things neutral, he said. Beige walls, beige curtains, beige life. So one morning I went to the hardware store and picked out the brightest yellow I could find. Sunshine yellow. By evening my kitchen glowed like a field of daffodils. Every morning after that, I drank my coffee at the table and smiled. My house finally felt like mine. I joined a women's circle at the library. Widows, divorcees, single mothers. Women with stories of loss and resilience. We met every Tuesday to knit, drink tea, and talk about everything under the sun. They welcomed me with open arms, no judgment, just sisterhood. Through them, I learned something I'd forgotten. Life doesn't end at 70. It shifts. It reshapes itself. Caroline flew me out to Denver in the spring. We hiked trails, shopped at farmers markets, and laughed late into the night. One evening, as we watched the sunset turn the mountains pink, she turned to me. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, "I'm proud of you. For not letting Dad's choices define you." Tears stung my eyes. "I thought I'd lost everything," I admitted. "You didn't," she said. "You lost him. And that's not the same." David visited too. He mowed the lawn, fixed the leaky faucet, and made me promise to call if I needed anything. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch swing, he said, "You know, Mom, I never realized how strong you are. I always thought Dad was the anchor. But it was you. It was always you." Those words healed something in me I hadn't even known was raw. And then there was Harold. I saw him once by accident in the grocery store. He was thinner, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn. He looked years older than his 72. He glanced up, saw me, and froze. I nodded politely and walked past. No words exchanged, because what was left to say? His choices had written the ending. I heard later that Lorraine never came back, that she'd married a man in Columbus. Harold lived alone in his apartment, barely seen around town. There was a time I might have pitied him, but no. I saved my pity for people who deserved it. Summer rolled around and with it new adventures. I joined a walking group at the park and found joy in morning air and bird song. I bought watercolor paints and spent afternoons sketching the flowers in my backyard. I started reading again. Novels, memoirs, poetry. And slowly laughter crept back into my life. One day Margaret called and said, "Ellie, you need to travel. See something new. Shake the dust off your soul." I laughed, but she was right. So I did something I'd always dreamed of but never dared. I booked a trip to New Mexico. Alone. At 71, I boarded a plane by myself and stepped into a desert sky so wide it took my breath away. I walked through white sands, the dunes glowing silver under the moonlight, and felt as small and as free as I had ever been. Standing there, I realized something powerful. Betrayal hadn't ended me. It had freed me. Back home, I started to notice a gentleman from the walking group. Harold Johnson, a widower with kind eyes and a slow smile. He never pushed, never hurried me. One morning, he brought an extra thermos of coffee and asked if I wanted to sit on the bench a while. We talked about books, grandkids' favorite meals. Just simple things. Nothing heavy. When I got home, I caught myself smiling. Not the polite smile I'd worn for Harold Dawson for years, but a genuine one. I don't know if it will turn into anything more. And maybe it doesn't need to. The point isn't finding someone new. It's realizing I could. That my heart still had room for joy. Now when I sit on my porch swing, the same one Harold once sat on beside me, I feel peace. Not the fragile peace of pretending everything is fine, but the solid peace of surviving fire and stepping into light. The truth is, betrayal is a thief. It steals your trust, your security, your sense of self. But if you let it, it can also hand you back something else, your freedom. And freedom, my friends, is worth everything. So when I think back to that night at the Civic Center when Harold Dawson's mask fell away in front of the entire town, I don't feel shame anymore. I feel gratitude. Because that was the night my old life ended and my new one began. And as I tell you this story, I hope it reminds someone out there, maybe you listening right now, that no matter your age, no matter how deep the betrayal, you are not finished. You can rise again. Because if a 70-year-old grandmother from Willow Creek, Ohio, can build a new life from the ashes, so can you. If you found yourself in my place, what would you have done differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.